Romance. It has to have Hey yo, and welcome back to my channel where I talk about writer things, parent things, and writer-parent things. Today I'm going to be discussing a subject I'm very passionate about that I've been getting a lot of questions on, and that's genres. Do remember, folks, that my videos are based on my experience and understanding of the topics, which I have done a lot of reading, research, and dipping my toes in the waters of quite a few genres. I'm gonna go ahead and read right from the dictionary on what the definition of a genre is. A category of artistic composition, as in music or literature, characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. In writing, this could be tropes, narrative tones, commonly used vocabulary, plot formulas, etc., etc. When writing a story, it's really good to know what genre we're writing in. That way we can understand what the audience expectations are probably gonna be. Sometimes, using audience expectation against them can make for a great twist. Take The Chosen One, for instance. Why don't we make a chosen one who gets corrupted by evil and then becomes the antagonist? Most chosen ones are tempted, but end up overcoming that temptation in the end. However, we can't really use the audience expectations to our advantage or their disadvantage unless we understand what they are, which we can do by understanding our genres and how they work. Genres begin really simply. Is it a completely, totally made up story, or is it a factual, real book of information, such as cookbooks, memoirs, etc.? I know memoirs and biographies could be a little, but we're gonna go with completely factual for now. Fake made up stories go under the huge umbrella of fiction, whereas real factual stories go under the umbrella of nonfiction. For nonfiction, it just breaks down there based on what kind of book is it. Is it a cookbook, a biography, a memoir, etc., etc. Fiction, however, it gets a little sticky. Now we have the biggest two subgenres in our genre tree, which also act as umbrella genres in their own right. One could argue there are three, but we'll get to romance later. That is contemporary and speculative fiction. Contemporary stories take place in the modern day world and could conceivably be true, whether it's about a kid's day at the park or a barista working their way through college. The important point is that this story could honestly happen in modern day Earth. Speculative fiction, however, pretty much encompasses everything else, whether it takes place in a magical world, an alternative Earth, or a futuristic society. They just can't realistically take place on Earth. So far, it's really simple, right? Fake or not fake. Takes place on Earth, doesn't take place on Earth. Now we're going to get into the subgenres of speculative fiction. Contemporary also technically has subgenres, but we will get into that later, as well as discuss the romance genre. At this point, I'm not going to go into every single subgenre of speculative fiction, because there are many and I'm not an expert on all of them. Sci-fi, for example, is not my forte. So I'm just going to give a quick rundown on one of the subgenres I know really well, horror. So starting from the top, we've got fiction, and now we're going down fiction to speculative fiction, and then we're going to go down speculative fiction to horror. What are our tiny little branches at horror? Gore and disturbing, psychological, monster, and paranormal. And then these ones have their own tiny branches. Beyond this point, subgenres start to get very specific and, well, very mixed sometimes. For example, werewolves. Werewolves are very obviously in the monster subgenre. However, what about when the monster is a demon or a devil? Is that in the monster, paranormal, or possibly both? Don't want to be limited by the trends of a single genre? Want to be able to do what you want without having to follow the very rigid expectations of a specific subgenre? Don't worry, my friends. Luckily, there are crossover genres. See, the thing with crossover genres is they can be between the big umbrella genres, such as sci-fi and contemporary, and even seem to contradict themselves, like contemporary fantasy. But hey, some of us just want to write our stories about witches running magical coffee shops in the modern day Earth. In this case, I would recommend researching both of the umbrella genres and the crossover genre, because the more we understand the trends and audience expectations of the genres, the easier it is to navigate them. Knowing this, it is vital to mention that some genres just have crossover characteristics. For example, horror. Horror often has magic elements to it. It even has its own subgenre known as paranormal, which focuses more on the magical or mystical elements to the genre. It's still horror, not horror fantasy. We can flip that, however, as normally fantasy does not contain horror elements, so when fantasy does contain horror elements, it's considered dark fantasy. Sci-fi and fantasy are two huge ones that majorly overlap so much that I really think it just boils down to whatever the story's backdrop is. And when someone is uncertain of whether or not their work falls under fantasy or sci-fi, I propose one question. How is most of the whooshy whoosh explained? Magic or science? And once we know that, we can go through the umbrella genre and maybe see if there's a subgenre that fits better. Working from the top down is always the easiest way to find a subgenre, in my humble opinion. Returning to our contemporary and romance topics. Now, while researching for this video, romance was the only subgenre I could find under contemporary that was not also a crossover genre from the speculative fiction branch. And contemporary seems to be the main home for romance. Now, an interesting aspect of the romance genre is that it seems to have a subgenre or crossover genre with every other umbrella and the umbrella's subgenres. It sure do get around. As I briefly touched on earlier, I do actually believe that the umbrellas underneath fiction could be contemporary, speculative fiction, and romance, but from my research it doesn't appear to be that way, so it is what it is, and this is how it is. So instead of just being its own little umbrella up there, romance seems to have a house in contemporary and little apartments everywhere else. I really wanted to bring up the topic of gatekeepers, which are people who are very, very into their genre of choice, to the point they think they know everything and anything, and if it doesn't, in their opinion, fit, they tell people that their stories don't fit into genres that they actually do. As previously stated, some genres are just super simple to fit into, such as fantasy. The actual definition of fantasy is just, does it take place on Earth? No, it might be fantasy. Magic isn't even a requirement. Yet a lot of people will say that if there is no magic, it's not fantasy. Sometimes gatekeepers, or just the misinformed, will pull out the phrases low fantasy and high fantasy to make their complex magic systems seem like they are some sort of fantasy elite. Looking up the definitions, this is simply factually inaccurate. Low fantasy is fantasy that takes place on Earth and has some sort of elements that make it not contemporary, whereas high fantasy just takes place literally anywhere else, whether it has magic or not. Interestingly enough, this means that low fantasy stories may actually contain more magic or complex magic systems than high fantasy does, because magic is required in low fantasy, not so much in high fantasy. Which means to fit in the fantasy genre, our story really just cannot take place on Earth as we know it. This isn't to say that there are no subgenres or genres that require a very specific thing. After all, romance must have a happy ending with the couple together at the end. And urban fantasy has to take place in a city with supernatural elements. Generally on Earth, but that's a trend, not a requirement. And to sum up my two biggest pieces of advice, Google your genre definition. Learn the trends, learn the tropes, learn everything you can about it. And when trying to learn the subgenres, start from the top of the tree and work your way down. While researching, it's also important to keep in mind that if we want to write in a certain genre and there is an aspect that seems like it just would cancel it out from fitting in there, there may be a subgenre that turns that requirement on its head and your story may fit in perfectly. With as complex, convoluted, and contradicting as this can all seem, Why should we bother? Why does it matter? Why do all of this work? Marketing. In order to tell our audience, hey, this book may be right up your alley, we have to signal that to them. And the easiest way is to tell them what genre it is. After all, if I'm looking for a happy story that's got a lot of cute couple shit in it, I'm gonna look for a romance. On the other hand, if a friend recommends a sci-fi to me, I already know it's probably going to contain some tropes that I'm not the biggest fan of, but hey, I know going into it. Alright everyone, that's all I got for you this week. Did this clear up any questions for you? Do you have more questions now? What are your favorite genres? What genres don't you like? Let me know in the description down below. I'm still hosting live streams every Monday at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. If you'd like to see if I can write, you can check out my website, SamanthaLNasset.com, where I post some short stories. Or if you'd prefer to stalk my social media, that's cool too, at SamanthaLNasset. I'm on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Facebook. If you enjoyed that video, maybe give it a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, ring-a-ding that bell, and you can be notified when I post new videos on Wednesdays and when my live streams go live. Thanks for watching. Sam out!